It all started as a joke, a ridiculous challenge between me and my best friend Chris. 6 days to turn me gay, he said, laughing like it was the most absurd thing in the world. At first, I went along with it, confident it would lead nowhere. But as the days passed, something shifted. What began as a game became something far more complicated, and I was left questioning everything I thought I knew about myself. I never expected this challenge to change my life, and my heart, forever. Before we dive into this emotional story, make sure to follow our page, subscribe to the channel, and like this video. Leave a comment below and share your thoughts on this unique challenge. Your engagement helps us continue to bring you more stories like this. Chris had always been the daring one, the kind of guy who thrived on risks and ridiculous ideas. So when he leaned across the table at our favorite diner and said, 6 days to turn you gay, I knew he wasn't joking. His grin was wide, his eyes sparkling with that mischievous energy I'd seen too many times before. Come on, man. That's ridiculous, I laughed, taking a sip of my soda. I'm serious, he shot back, leaning closer. I bet I can prove that sexuality isn't as black and white as you think. You just have to give me 6 days. If by the end of it you're still the same straight guy you claim to be, I'll drop it. And if I'm not? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Chris shrugged, smirking. Then I win. Simple as that. I shook my head, amused but unconvinced. Chris, I don't think this is how it works. Exactly my point, he said, leaning back in his chair. You don't know until you try. I rolled my eyes but couldn't stop the small laugh that escaped. Fine, I said, playing along. 6 days, but don't expect any miracles. Chris's face lit up with excitement, and for a moment, I wondered what I had just gotten myself into. The first day was uneventful, mostly because I didn't take it seriously. Chris had decided we'd hang out as usual, watching a movie at his place, eating junk food, and laughing at old inside jokes. It felt like any other day, until the conversation shifted. So, he said, during a quiet moment in the film, have you ever thought about it? Thought about what? I asked, confused. About being with a guy, he said, his tone casual but his eyes focused on me. Like, ever been curious? I paused, not because I had an answer, but because I hadn't expected the question. Not really, I said after a moment. Why? Chris shrugged. Just wondering. Most people don't even give it a second thought, you know, but maybe they should. I didn't respond, but his words lingered. The rest of the night continued like normal, but as I drove home, I couldn't shake the conversation. Why had I never thought about it? Was it really just a part of who I was, or had I been too afraid to question it? On the second day, Chris took a different approach. We're going out tonight, he said over the phone, his voice brimming with enthusiasm. And no, you don't get to say no. When I arrived at the bar, it wasn't the usual sports bar we frequented. Instead, it was a small, lively place with dim lights and a crowd that was different. There was an undeniable energy in the air, a mix of freedom and celebration that I couldn't quite describe. Chris greeted me with a drink and a grin. Relax, he said, patting my shoulder. Just have fun. I followed him to a booth where he introduced me to some of his friends. They were friendly, engaging, and unapologetically themselves. As the night went on, I found myself laughing more than I had in months, their openness and honesty disarming in a way I didn't expect. By the time I got home, my head was spinning, not from the drinks, but from the realization that maybe, just maybe, Chris was onto something. The third day started like any other. I woke up, made coffee, and scrolled through my phone absent-mindedly. Chris had already texted, his usual enthusiasm coming through loud and clear. Chris, today's the day we step it up. Get ready. I rolled my eyes, but couldn't help the small smile tugging at my lips. I didn't know what step it up meant, but I was sure Chris had something ridiculous planned. By mid-afternoon, I was at his place. He greeted me at the door with that signature grin, one hand holding a bag of clothes. "Change into these," he said, shoving the bag into my chest. I frowned, opening the bag to reveal a fitted button-up shirt and a pair of jeans that looked a little snug. "What's this for?" "We're going to a gallery opening," he said casually. "It's a friend's thing, and I thought you might want to look decent." "Chris, I'm fine in what I'm wearing." "No, you're not," he said, smirking. "Trust me." With a dramatic sigh, I went to the bathroom to change. When I stepped out, Chris gave me an approving nod. "See? Told you it would work." "You owe me for this," I muttered. But secretly, I felt a small surge of confidence. The clothes fit better than I expected. The gallery was small but packed, the walls lined with abstract paintings that I didn't quite understand. Chris introduced me to a few people, but one person stood out. Ethan, the artist behind the exhibit. He was tall, with a quiet charm and a soft smile that somehow felt disarming. Chris, ever the instigator, disappeared halfway through our conversation, leaving Ethan and me to fend for ourselves. At first, the awkwardness was palpable, but Ethan had a way of making me feel at ease. "So, what do you think of the show?" he asked, his tone light. "It's interesting," I said honestly. "I don't know much about art, but some of these pieces really make you think." Ethan smiled. "That's the point, isn't it? To make people feel something." The way he said it, his eyes locked on mine, made my stomach twist in a way I didn't understand. There was something about him, his confidence, his openness, that made me question everything I thought I knew about myself. By the time Chris and I left, my mind was racing. The night had been fun, but it also left me feeling off balance. "What did you think?" Chris asked as we walked to the car. "About what?" "About Ethan," he said, grinning. I felt heat rise to my face. "He's cool," I said quickly, hoping to end the conversation. Chris raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. "You're thinking about it now, aren't you?" "About what?" "Everything," he said simply. "That's all I wanted." The fourth day brought more questions than answers. Chris and I spent the afternoon at the park, tossing a football back and forth like we used to in high school. It was easy, comfortable, until Chris brought it up again. "So, any thoughts on Ethan?" I groaned. "Chris, drop it." "Why? You liked talking to him, didn't you?" I hesitated, and Chris caught it immediately. "You don't have to lie to me," he said, his tone softer now. "I'm not trying to push you into anything. I just want you to see that it's okay to feel something different." I looked at him, seeing the sincerity in his expression. It was rare for Chris to be this serious, and it caught me off guard. "I don't know what I'm feeling," I admitted finally. "But it's confusing as hell." Chris smiled, tossing the football back to me. "That's a start." That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the past few days. About Chris, about Ethan, about the way my life seemed to be shifting in ways I didn't understand. The challenge that had started as a joke was beginning to feel like something much bigger, and for the first time, I wasn't sure if I was ready for where it was leading me. By the fifth day, the line between the challenge and reality had blurred. What had started as a joke now felt like a doorway I wasn't sure I wanted to step through. Chris seemed to sense it, though he didn't push me as hard as before. Instead, he let the silence between us speak for itself. "So, what's the plan today?" I asked over breakfast at a cafe. I tried to sound casual, but my nerves betrayed me. "No plan," Chris said, shrugging. "I thought we could just hang out. Maybe go for a drive or something." I frowned. No grand scheme? No lectures on questioning my existence? Chris laughed, shaking his head. "Not today. You've been through enough." It should have been a relief, but instead it left me feeling more unsettled. The absence of his usual energy made me wonder if something had changed for him, too. We spent the morning driving aimlessly, the windows down and the radio playing old songs that reminded us of high school. The familiarity of it was comforting, but there was a tension between us that neither of us seemed willing to address. "Do you regret taking the challenge?" Chris asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the music. I glanced at him, startled. "Why would you ask that?" He kept his eyes on the road. I know it's been a lot. I don't want you to feel like I've pushed you too hard." I thought about it for a moment before answering. "I don't regret it," I said honestly, "but it's been confusing." Chris nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Confusion's not a bad thing, you know. Sometimes it's how you figure out what really matters." That evening, we ended up at Chris's apartment. It felt like the right place to unwind after such a strange and emotional week. He ordered pizza, and we settled onto the couch, the atmosphere relaxed for the first time in days. As we ate, Chris turned to me, his tone lighter than before. "Okay, real talk. What's been going through your head?" I hesitated, not sure how much I wanted to share. But something about the way he looked at me, open, patient, made it easier to speak. "It's like everything I thought I knew about myself is shifting," I said, "and I don't know what to do with that." Chris nodded, his expression serious. "That's not a bad thing, man. It means you're growing." "But what if I don't like where I'm growing?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Then you figure it out," he said simply. "No one's asking you to have all the answers right now." The conversation hung in the air, heavy but not uncomfortable. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I didn't have to pretend. As the night wore on, Chris leaned back, his arm resting on the back of the couch. "You know, no matter what happens after this, I'm proud of you," he said, "for being honest with yourself." I looked at him, my chest tightening. "You're the one who made me question it in the first place." He smirked. "Yeah, but you're the one who's been brave enough to face it." Something in his voice, in the way he looked at me, made my stomach twist. It was a moment of clarity, a realization that the feelings I had been trying to ignore were right there, staring me in the face. Before I could say anything, Chris shifted closer, his knee brushing against mine. "Can I ask you something?" he said softly. "Yeah," I replied, my heart racing. "Have you thought about what it would mean to let go of what you think you're supposed to be?" I swallowed hard, his question hitting me like a freight train. "I don't know," I admitted, "but maybe I'm ready to find out." Chris's gaze softened, and for a moment, the space between us felt charged with something I couldn't name. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the moment passed. Chris leaned back, breaking the tension with a laugh. "No pressure, dude. We've still got one more day." I laughed too, though my mind was still reeling. One more day. One more chance to figure out what this all meant. The 6th and final day arrived, and with it, an overwhelming sense of anticipation. Chris texted me early in the morning, his message short but packed with weight. "Let's make this day count." I wasn't sure what that meant, but I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The challenge was almost over, and yet I had no answers. If anything, I felt more confused than ever. When I arrived at Chris's apartment, he greeted me with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You ready for this?" he asked, his tone lighter than his expression. "I guess," I replied, forcing a smile. He had planned a simple day, lunch at a cafe we'd both loved growing up, followed by a walk in the park. It felt almost mundane, but the undercurrent of unspoken emotions between us made every moment feel significant. As we walked through the park, Chris broke the silence. "So," he said, kicking a loose pebble along the path, What's the verdict? Did I succeed? I laughed nervously, not sure how to answer. I don't think it's that simple, Chris. He stopped walking and turned to face me, his expression serious now. I'm not asking you to label yourself or anything like that. I just want to know, did this week change anything for you? I looked at him, my heart pounding in my chest. Yeah, I said after a moment. It changed a lot. His lips curved into a small smile, but there was something hesitant in his eyes. Good, he said softly. That's all I wanted. We ended up back at his apartment later that afternoon, both of us unusually quiet. The weight of the week hung between us, neither of us sure how to break the tension. Finally, Chris spoke. You know, I never expected this to go the way it did, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought it would be a joke, something we'd laugh about later. But it became something more. I nodded, my throat tight. Yeah, it did. Chris leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. And now I don't know what to do with that. The honesty in his words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to tell him that I felt the same, that I didn't know what to do either. But before I could find the words, he stood up, pacing the room. This was never supposed to be serious, he said, almost to himself. I didn't want to complicate things. You think I wanted this to be easy? I snapped, surprising even myself with the intensity in my voice. This week has turned my life upside down, Chris, and now you're telling me it wasn't supposed to mean anything? Chris froze, his back to me, his shoulders tense. I never said it didn't mean anything, he said quietly. It means everything. The room fell silent, the weight of his words pressing down on both of us. Slowly, he turned to face me, his expression raw and vulnerable. I'm scared, man. Scared of what this means for us. Me too, I admitted. But I think we owe it to ourselves to figure it out. Chris nodded, his eyes glistening. Yeah, we do. The moment felt like a breaking point, a crossroads where everything could either fall apart or come together. But before either of us could say another word, Chris's phone buzzed on the coffee table, shattering the tension. He grabbed it, glancing at the screen. It's my sister, he said, his voice suddenly distant. I need to take this. I nodded, watching as he stepped out onto the balcony to answer the call. Alone in the room, I felt a wave of uncertainty crash over me. What had we just done? What had we just said? When Chris returned, his face was pale, and his hands were trembling. I have to go, he said abruptly, grabbing his keys and jacket. What's going on? I asked, standing up. My sister. There's been an accident, he said, his voice breaking. I don't have time to explain. Before I could respond, he was out the door, leaving me standing there, stunned. The gravity of the week, of the emotions we had just shared, was suddenly overshadowed by the harsh reality of life crashing back in. As I sat down on the couch, my heart heavy with a mix of emotions, one thought lingered in my mind. This wasn't over. Not yet. The hours after Chris left felt like an eternity. I stayed in his apartment, staring at the ceiling, replaying our conversation over and over. The rawness of his words, the way his voice had cracked, it all left me feeling exposed and uncertain. When he finally called late that night, his voice was strained but steady. She's stable, he said without preamble. But it was close. Relief flooded through me. Thank God. Do you need anything? Should I come over? No, he said quickly, then softened. I mean, thanks, but we've got it handled here. I just wanted to let you know. The call ended abruptly, leaving me feeling hollow. The weight of everything that had happened between us lingered, unspoken, and unresolved. The next day, I woke to find a text from Chris. "Let's talk tonight." Simple, direct, but it was enough to make my chest tighten. By evening, I was standing outside his apartment, my heart pounding. When he opened the door, he looked exhausted, his usual spark dimmed by the events of the past 24 hours. "Hey," he said softly, stepping aside to let me in. "Hey," I replied, trying to read his expression. There was something distant in his eyes, something I couldn't quite place. We sat in the living room, the silence between us heavy. Finally, Chris spoke. "This week. It's been a lot." I nodded, waiting for him to continue. "I didn't think this would happen," he admitted, his voice low. "I didn't think I'd feel this way about you." His words hung in the air, and I felt my breath catch. "Chris, He held up a hand, stopping me. "Let me finish. I care about you, more than I ever thought I could. But this, us, it's complicated." "Why does it have to be?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Why can't we just try?" Chris looked at me, his eyes filled with a pain I didn't understand. "Because I don't know if I can be what you need," he said. "I don't know if I'm ready for this." The conversation spiraled from there, every word feeling like a cut. I tried to reason with him, to convince him that we could figure it out together, but he kept pulling away, retreating behind walls I couldn't break through. "Maybe it's better if we take a step back," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I stared at him, the finality of his words sinking in. "Is that what you really want?" "I don't know what I want," he admitted, his voice cracking. "And that's the problem." When I left his apartment that night, I felt like I was walking away from more than just a conversation. I was walking away from a possibility, a future that had felt so close only to slip through my fingers. As I drove home, the city lights blurred through the tears I hadn't realized I was holding back. I told myself it wasn't over, that this was just a temporary setback, but deep down I wasn't sure if I believed it. The days after our conversation passed in a haze. Chris and I didn't talk, not a single text, not a call. It felt as though the weight of everything we'd shared was too much for either of us to bear. I told myself to give him space, to wait for him to reach out, but the silence stretched longer than I expected. On the 6th day after our last talk, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I needed answers, closure, something. I drove to his apartment, rehearsing what I would say, but as I pulled into his street, I saw flashing lights. Red and blue illuminated the night, and my stomach sank. I parked a block away and ran toward his building, my chest tightening with every step. A small crowd had gathered near the entrance, their whispers filling the air like static. My heart pounded as I pushed my way to the front, only to be stopped by a police officer. "What's going on?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "I'm looking for Chris Thompson. He lives here." The officer's expression softened, but it didn't ease the knot in my chest. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "There's been an incident. Are you family?" I shook my head, barely able to form words. "I'm his friend. Please, just tell me he's okay." The officer hesitated before gesturing to the ambulance parked nearby. "They're taking him now." I followed his gaze and saw the paramedics loading a stretcher into the back. My legs moved on autopilot, carrying me closer until I saw him. Chris, pale and motionless, an oxygen mask covering his face. "Chris!" I shouted, but he didn't move. The paramedics closed the doors before I could get closer. Hours later, I sat in the hospital waiting room, my hands trembling as I stared at the floor. No one would tell me anything. All I could do was wait. Finally, a doctor approached, her face grim. "Are you here for Christopher Thompson?" she asked. I nodded, barely able to breathe. "Is he okay?" Her pause was answer enough. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "We did everything we could, but his injuries were too severe." The words didn't register at first. I stared at her, hoping I'd misheard. "No," I said, my voice breaking. "That's not possible. He was fine. He was fine." The doctor placed a hand on my shoulder, but her touch felt distant. "I'm so sorry for your loss." The days that followed were a blur. Chris's family handled the arrangements, and I attended the funeral, standing silently among people who didn't know the depth of what we'd shared. I kept replaying our last conversation, wondering if I'd said something wrong, if I could have done something differently. It wasn't until weeks later, when I finally gathered the courage to clean out his apartment with his sister, that I found the note. It was tucked into a book on his nightstand, addressed simply, "To Matt." My hands shook as I opened it, the familiar scrawl bringing tears to my eyes. "Matt, I don't know how to say this out loud, so I'm writing it here. I'm scared of what this means, scared of losing you, scared of myself. But the truth is, I care about you more than I've ever cared about anyone. I just don't know how to be the person you deserve. If you're reading this, I hope you know that none of this was your fault. You made me feel something real, something I didn't think I was capable of. Thank you for that. Always, Chris." The note didn't bring closure. It only added to the ache. But it also gave me something I hadn't realized I needed. Proof that what we shared was real, even if it was fleeting. As I left his apartment for the last time, I felt a bittersweet sense of peace. Chris had been my best friend, my greatest challenge, and my deepest heartbreak. And though his absence left a void I knew I'd never fill, I also knew he had changed me in ways I couldn't yet fully understand. Somewhere, I hoped he had found the peace he couldn't find here, and as I stepped into the sunlight, I promised myself I would carry his memory with me, always. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. How would you navigate a challenge like this? Don't forget to follow our page, subscribe to the channel, and share this video to keep these important conversations alive. Thank you for watching.